2, 1, and we are now live. So welcome to everyone, and this is our first 2020 True Entrepreneur Story live Facebook streaming, and we have our first guest of 2020 for this first Facebook Live, Maria Zdravkova. Did I say this right, Maria?
Yes, you did, Ariane. It's very good.
Thank you very much. And I've been practicing. So here you go. So let me introduce you to our fantastic guest today. So Maria was born in Bulgaria. She did most of her studies. She did her studies in Bulgaria, then moved on to Spain, where she did her master in advanced finance, then her internship in Bulgaria, moved on to her first job in Germany and as a credit office hedge funds. And the second position you got into finance was portfolio management specialist for DWS. So it's quite international here. Maria speaks loads of different languages, obviously her mother tongue, but also Spanish, fluently Spanish, German, English, obviously, because Maria is now based in West London, in Chiswick, in the lovely Chiswick area. If any of you know this area, I quite like it myself. So yes, and Maria is the founder of Money Chats. So that's moneychats.com. And we're here today talking about money for all the startup entrepreneurs and small business owners following us here at True Entrepreneur Stories podcast. So welcome, Maria.
Thank you, Ariane.
So Maria, we had a little discussion beforehand, and I had quite a few questions for you. I think you have a lot to contribute to our podcast today with our viewers and our listeners. And I think I'd like to ask you, I'm guessing like everyone else, how and why did you get into business finance and portfolio management? What's your big why?
As I mentioned to you privately before, I love money. I realized at a very early age that not being good with money is not a good thing in life. It brings a lot of limitations, a lot of struggles. Not worrying about money allows you to focus on things that are really important, but the majority of people are so busy worrying about money that that's basically their days and their weeks and their months sometimes. So I didn't want to be in this position, and I realized that I need to know about money because very often it's not about how much you make, it's about how much you keep, and it's about understanding. Most people think that if they make a little bit more, everything is going to be okay. And then they discover that it isn't. We have great examples of movie stars and sports people, especially boxers, are particularly good at making great money and then going bankrupt. So, yeah, that was always interesting for me.
So money is definitely freedom, isn't it? And like you mentioned, it allows that freedom to make decision on other factors than money, isn't it? When coming down to making decisions, so it's taking out of the equation when you are financially free to make decisions based upon other factors, isn't it?
Exactly. It takes out a lot of stress.
So that was the very big why. And coming next to our next question, your favorite quotes. So What's your favorite quote, Maria?
I have two actually, and they're for different situation. In terms of personal finance, I have a very favorite quote from a show called Lipstick Jungle. One of the main characters was dating a billionaire, and she asked him something about what he can afford, and he said, "It's not what I can afford; it's what I choose to afford." So I think it's very important to think what we choose to afford. It's a lot of us spend money on things that are just a distraction from what's really important, and that is manageable. Just think what you choose to afford. And in terms of small business and any business, actually, what I learned in business school and in life is that cash is king. That is the most important thing. You might be having great receivables and revenues. In theory, if no cash is coming in, you're in trouble.
Absolutely. Cash is king. That was your quote number 2, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think it's very important for business owners.
Absolutely, I can't agree more. Cash is king, especially in our society. I think that we did mention this when we announced today's episode. Unfortunately, we are governed by cash, so it is a necessity. So that was for quote, your favorite quote. One other question we had was, what do you like the most about what you do, Maria?
We also mentioned part of this when we announced that apart from health, money is the second very important thing in life, and very often it can help even with health issues. Sometimes they're just a matter of, can you afford that?
Mm-hmm.
So it's really good to be able to help people to improve their situation and their quality of life by teaching them more about how to deal with their finances. And as you know, I'm especially keen on helping women. That was based on my personal experiences, because I had my own travel. Despite my job being a lot about finance, I was not always good with my personal situation, but once I realized that, I was able to change it very, very quickly because I did have the knowledge. And speaking to my friends, I realized that it wasn't just me. A lot of very well educated and doing very well professionally friends of mine, female, turned out they were not investing. They were not thinking so much about their financial planning
Mm-hmm.
and financial future. So I realized that we are a bit behind, and it's good to do something in this direction. And then after that, the business finance gap and need also just appeared. So,
And I guess money talks, money chats is still taboo in a way. It has been a very long time and still is in a way. We start to talk more about money, but it's still seen as a taboo subject from what I can see. And I think having that open conversation with whether it's business owners, small startup entrepreneurs, or even people in general, having that open talk, that open dialogue, really helps. Don't you agree?
I absolutely agree, and it's very good to go seek professional help if you are struggling to organize your thing. Even if you don't want to speak with your friends, they're not always in a position to help you. But speaking to somebody who is specializing with this could be very helpful, especially based on the fact that they're not going to go gossip about it because it's between you and them. Sometimes, especially if you're really struggling, spending a little bit of money that you think you cannot afford, just put it aside and do it. It will save you a lot and it will improve things a lot in the future. Look at the long game. This is my money philosophy, is look at the long game. It's always better to do what is better long term, even if you have to restrict some consumption and give up something that you think you cannot live without at the moment.
Absolutely. That's so very true. And also, I think because those subjects are not so much talked about, a lot of people are going through a hard time, and even some people go through depression. It's so much stress, so much pressure, financial problems can become so much of a problem that some people do fall into depression, and some cases are pretty bad, isn't it, Maria?
Yeah, it is. And people are hiding it and they seem like they're doing great and everything is fine. But then you realize that, I'll give an example. I had this understanding once I started discussing these topics. My friends were not excited or super open about it, but I feel very passionate on the topic. So I was telling them what I'm planning to do. I was telling them about my seminars, about my research, about my discoveries. So people will start sharing a little bit more and be a bit more relaxed. And I obviously don't want to share anybody's story who's shared anything with me. But I realized that people who I thought had a very comfortable life were actually living, if not month to month, 2 to 3 months ahead, and they were basically going to default on payments. Everything was on credit.
Mm-hmm.
Everything was, it was nothing like it looked, and I realized that this should bring actually a lot of stress.
And it's many more people than we think. I think
Yes.
things have changed in our society where credit is much more available, much more accessible, and a lot of people tell me if I'm right or not. But people get in a lot of problem because now credit is so available and so accessible.
You're absolutely right, and it's actually a very cultural thing. The situation in Germany is very different, but Anglo-Saxon culture is that a lot of social pressure. People feel they need to have certain things. They are expected to behave a certain way. If you're making a certain income, they have to be spending certain amount. And it's very funny because I'll give you an example. I remember a time when my salary increased with 500 euro and my credit card limit was increased with 6,000 euro. That is 12 times more, right? So the more you make, the more credit is available to you. And if you don't know how to control yourself, and just to mention, the charges on the credit card were around 1% a month.
Mm.
And people ignore that
Yes.
because even if it's not a huge limit, if you have 5,000 in credit card debt, that can, if you're not paying it off, if you're just paying minimum payments, it can go to about 500 per year. It's ridiculous.
Yes. It's quite frightening. And going back to business a little bit, because a lot of our viewers and listeners are entrepreneurs or small business owners. Would you like to share with them two things that you would have liked to know long ago and would like to share with them? So a piece of advice for startup community watching us today.
Yeah, I think it's very important to do your research. I did quite a bit of research before I started doing these seminars. So I knew that I was working in a bank, and if there were women there who were not investing, that is happening in every other institution around. So really know your market, know your target, and I think that's the most important in order to start.
And it's not because you are a startup that you should leave the figures, the numbers for later, isn't it?
Oh no, definitely not. It's that is my financial advice is actually going to be to learn your numbers. You don't have to be an accountant. You don't have to be a master of that, but I think everybody needs to understand their financial statements. I've noticed that there are people who are starting a business and they don't make a difference between very basic terms, starting from what is revenue, what is gross profit, what is net profit. Take it the following way. You should know on what you're paying taxes and what you can subtract before you pay taxes,
Yes,
because it's going to decrease your taxes. There are people who don't understand what that is. They have 300 in revenues. They think they have to pay taxes on these 300, but that is not the situation. So,
exactly. And we discovered that quite recently, isn't it, Maria?
yes, it was a super interesting talk that Vinu gave us at the Gaia Network, and it was very useful for me.
Mhm.
But I
To
realized,
have an insight
yes,
on what is actually going on, like you mentioned, isn't it, Maria?
exactly. It was very interesting what I learned from Vinu, who is an accountant, which I am not. I'm a finance professional, but I'm not an accountant. So his insights were very interesting for me. But the reaction of the audience was even more interesting for me, because I realized, okay, people, I applaud the fact that they're doing something. I think taking action is very important, and it's better to do something and fail or learn on the way than waiting to be perfect
Yes,
and never putting anything outside. That is definitely very important. And in a way, I'm doing the same. I mean, even my website is still under construction and it's getting slowly improved, but it's there. If you want to find me, you can find me, and I'm doing
absolutely. And
something.
that's one of the teachings that I pass on to my startup and small business owners is to start somewhere. You must have obviously a strategy, a plan, but you have to start. And business, just like finance, um, is a work in progress. So you start in very similar ways, finance and business. You start with a plan, and with time, with the environment, things will change, isn't it, Maria?
Exactly. Everything will change, but you need to do a little bit of research and know about the financial situation, because every small business has financials, right? It's not something the way every person has personal finance, the same way every business has financials, and that's what we are working for: profit and revenue. So they need to know what is happening over there and how this is working.
So, Maria, for our startup entrepreneurs listening, what are the key elements they should investigate?
So the first one, we've been already speaking about that. It's the profit and loss statement, also known as the income statement. And this is exactly where you're going to see your revenues, your expenses, then your gross profit, and after those taxes, you're going to see net income. This is extremely simplified, But this, I think, is the most important thing to be understood by a small business owner. When your accountant does these things for you, you need to understand those numbers and what they are.
Yeah. So moving on to our small business owners. So we were talking about startup entrepreneurs. Moving on to small business owners who already had a financial plan, who have a general understanding of their finance, of their business finance. So they have two options, right? Financially, with their business as an exit strategy for their business, which is either to sell their business on or to go IPO, initial public offer, to find public to sell shares too of their business. And in mind, as a business, as a financial planner, what should business owners focus on with that in mind, with an exit strategy in mind?
So they need to realize that those financial statements that they are getting, income statement, balance sheet, and cash flow statement, are what is going, or projections on them. So there's going to be taken certain years of data, and based on that there's going to be projected certain growth, and these statements are going to be projected for a few years ahead, 5 years, 10 years, depends on the industry, depends on the economy, depends on many things. But these projections are going to be used to come up with a number that you can sell your business for, or if it's going to be an IPO, share price, target share price. This is what's going to be used. It's when you're selling, you're not selling the assets of your business, but you're selling discounted future cash flows.
Yes,
So
the potential, yes. And obviously adding the traction to the business, the traction of the business in terms of following, for example, and some additional things to the finance and the numbers, isn't it, Maria?
Yeah.
So all this to say is very important. It's not because you're a startup that you should whisk through this. You should take a moment, isn't it? And understand the numbers and focus on the bottom line, which is money is king, making money, profits, right?
Yeah, exactly. Making some profit, and it also is what is used for planning. You have to take those statements, and you can come up with what you need to do in a year or in a month. You can come to particular numbers, how many new clients you need, how many new orders you need. It's very easy to plan and to manage when you understand those numbers.
And another thing we forgot to mention was if a small business is looking into getting finance from banks or private investors, they will look at those figures, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. These figures are used for everything, basically, except for your physical production or finding clients. These figures are used for everything. It's to give you an example, you can go and look at those figures when you buy cosmetics. I've seen a couple of very useful YouTube videos where somebody analyzed and explained that the production costs for a unit of a very expensive cosmetics line was very similar as to a pharmacy drugstore brand quality. So when you're buying the more expensive one, there is maybe a little bit more expense on research and development. But the rest is branding and marketing.
Yes.
So it doesn't get much better than the pharmacy brand. So it's really useful to understand that not just for your own business, but for the way that you're spending. You can look into your suppliers and see if you can maybe find a similar quality on a better price. Who knows?
Absolutely. We're moving on now to business tips, Maria. So let's see what we had. We did cover this just now. Business tip number one, just a recap. So it was understanding your income statement, the difference between revenue, gross profits, net profits, and which number the tax is being paid for. So that was tip number one, which applies to startup entrepreneurs as well. Okay,
Yes.
let's be clear on that. Business tip number two, understand the cash flow, the difference between revenue, sources of cash. Yes, was that correct? The business tip number two?
Yeah, that was correct, because revenue doesn't always equal cash flow. For startups and smaller companies, it could be a close number, but it is not the same number. And it's important to understand the uses of cash, where your cash is going out, and also the sources of cash from where it's coming in, because exactly those cash flows or the projection of those cash flows are going to be used for planning or to be discounted in order for evaluation to be done.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
business tip number three, use the understanding to plan, to model. I think we mentioned this earlier. So it's using it as a plan, and it's going to progress as the business progresses, as the environment changes, isn't it, Maria?
Exactly, and it's also really to help you plan reasonably. If you go back and look in the past 3 years and you realize that your growth was 5% and suddenly you want to plan for 30%, maybe not the best idea. Or maybe you have to come up with a new plan and see how you can make those 30% happen. I'm not saying it's impossible, but
Yes,
is it realistic?
it's just like with everything else. It's having a goal to achieve and having a strategy to get to the goal, isn't it? And it applies to finance as well. Wouldn't you say?
I would definitely say finance is like any other area. You have to plan, you have to develop, you have to learn.
Fabulous. So tell us, Maria, if some of our listeners, viewers are interested in getting in touch with you, they can have a quick look at your Money Chats website, which is money-chats.com. How else can they get in touch with you, Maria?
By email, I think you provided that. It's mimazdr@gmail.com.
We will add this in the comments, or they can get through to us, and we'll forward the inquiry onto you, Maria.
Sure.
Anything else that you would like to share that we didn't cover here, Maria, with our listeners and our viewers?
I think I have one advice for people that has been very helpful to me in other areas where I've struggled. There is a lot of information out there, and there is nothing super revolutionary. But if you want to save time, this is, I think, what we are providing. Time-saving, information synthesized and made simple. It's not a finance textbook for people who have never studied finance. And the most important part of the advice is that sometimes it really helps to make yourself accountable to another human being.
Yes, I second that. Absolutely. Accountability.
It's you're always going to go to the gym if you have a personal training session, and it's not so certain that I am going to go to the gym if left to my own devices. So this is another topic. If you're struggling, if it's difficult for you and you're always trying to, oh, I'm going to learn tomorrow or I'm going to read this tomorrow, but you're not doing it, just look for some help.
And especially for startup entrepreneurs or small business owners, they need to focus on delivering their crafts, their business services, their products. They are experts in what they do, so not so much in other things, and that's probably the best way to outsource to an expert like yourself. Learning, having a general understanding is very important. Like you mentioned earlier, Maria, I completely second that. You need to learn how to understand your numbers. You shouldn't rely 100% on someone else. You should be able to understand them yourself, isn't it, Maria?
Yeah, exactly. You do need to be able to understand. Once you are big enough, maybe you can hire yourself a chief financial officer or something like that. But until then, even then, you need to understand
Absolutely.
the basics.
Know your numbers. Know your numbers. Cash is king. We'll remember that. Maria, thank you so much for sharing some of your expertise with our listener and viewers here at True Stories of Entrepreneurs. Again, if you want to get in touch with Maria, either contact her directly or through us. We will be in touch, Maria, through the Gaia Network. It's very, in a similar way, you're very passionate about helping women in business.
Yes.
You have done back home, I believe.
Yes, actually in Germany.
In Germany.
Yeah.
So yes, and this is how we met, through the Gaia Network, Women in Business in West London. Things happen for a reason. Here you go.
Exactly. Thank you very much for having me, Ariane. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, Maria. And for our listener, join us next week where we have Hajat of Zen Treasures. So a slightly different subject next week, very interesting as well. But until then, feel free to get in touch with us, replay this. If you have any questions, please do get in touch. Thank you so much, Maria.
Thank you, Ariane. Bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.